Okay, good evening. So tonight we're going to talk about the supremacy of the prophecy of Moshe and what I think correlates with that, which is the eternity and unchangeable character of the Torah. And this corresponds to the end of the 8th chapter and then the 9th chapter of Yesodei HaTorah, the foundations of the Torah, in Maimonides' Book of Cognition. So I want to go back over some of the things that I talked about last time, that I think are very significant for today's topic. So, the prophecy of Moses, of Moshe Rabbeinu, is unique. It has a different basis from the prophecy, the authority of any other prophet. How is it unique? It does not rest on the performance of signs and wonders at all. It's true that Moshe performed signs and wonders, but those were only either in Egypt for the sake of Paro and the children of Israel before the Exodus. After the Exodus, however, and particularly after the occurrence at Mount Sinai, Rambam maintains that if there were any signs and wonders performed, those were for the sake of specific needs. They needed food, they needed water, and so on, but not in order to prove that Moshe was a genuine prophet. So after Mount Sinai, Moshe's authority is established in a different way and not on the basis of signs and wonders. And I think it's also important to note that this will be a recurrent theme. If you do have authority on the basis of performing signs and wonders, it's always subject to doubt. Just like the magicians were able to repeat and replicate some of Moshe's signs and wonders, so too you could never completely remove from your mind the possibility that a prophet who performed signs and wonders had some trick up his or her sleeve. Could be some kind of craft, some kind of sleight of hand, whatever it is. Okay, so then what is the authority of Moshe Rabbeinu, the prophecy of Moses, based on? So Rambam compares it to testimony, I think in a really interesting way. He says that if, this was already in the 8th parak, so we talked about it last time, if there are two witnesses, as are required in a court of Jewish law, and the two witnesses tell the same story, then one witness does not require any further proof or confirmation to believe the other witness. They both saw the same thing. They're both telling the same story. Right? So they have corroborating testimony. So this is not from the point of view of the court, it's from the point of view of one witness believing the other one. So if you look on the handout at 1C1, so this is going back to the first halacha in the 8th chapter. What then were the grounds of faith in him, in Moshe? The revelation on Sinai, which we saw with our own eyes and heard with our own ears, not having to depend on the testimony of others, we ourselves witnessing the fire, the thunder, the lightning, Moses entering the thick darkness, after which the divine voice spoke to him, while we heard the call, Moses, Moses, go tell them thus and thus. So the two witnesses in question then are us, the Jewish people, and Moshe on the other hand. Right? We both had the same experience. And so it is said, the Lord spoke with you face to face. In other words, not just Moshe, but in a certain way, the Jewish people. And furthermore, right, these are all quotations from Devarim, Deuteronomy. The Lord made not this covenant with our fathers only, but with us, even us who are all of us here alive this day. I'm going to talk more about what this means in a minute, but just to get the basic picture. Right? And then in the second halacha, the Rambam said, again in the 8th chapter, as those to whom Moshe was sent were themselves witnesses to the truth of his prophecy, right? In other words, because they saw the same thing, there was no need for him to show them any other sign, since they and he were witnesses to the same matter. They were like two witnesses who saw an event together. When giving their testimony in such a case, each of them is a witness that the other is telling the truth, and neither need bring proof of the credibility of the other. So was it with Moses, our teacher, Moshe Rabbeinu, After the revelation on Sinai, all Israel became witnesses for him, and there was no need for him to show them any further sign. This raises some important questions, I think. Two questions. First of all, why does Rambam use the first person plural? We saw it. How did we, who after all are living now in 2018, right? But that's emphasized, those of us all of us here alive today, it's meant to be in the present for all generations. How did we see what Moshe saw on Mount Sinai?
Aren't we all supposed to have been witness there?
Yes, but in what sense?
I thought we were supposed to all have been there.
Well, so I think there's a sort of a more mystical interpretation of that doctrine, which is that all of the Jewish souls were somehow present and then they recirculate. I strongly doubt that is Rambam's view. I don't think he would take such a mystical view. Something like that you'll find in Kabbalistic sources, but that's connected to the idea of reincarnation. There's no indication that Rambam believes anything.
So that's a popular idea.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people who say that, and there's a basis for it. I just don't think that could be what the Rambam means. Mm-hmm. So I want to give it a different explanation that fits with his rationalist philosophy. And the second question is going to be, even supposing that the Israelites living at that time saw the same event, what exactly does that mean? What did they see? Did they see everything the same? Even in what I just read, there's a moment when we saw the same thing, right? But then Moses enters the thick darkness, and the divine voice says, "Moses, go tell him thus and thus." So there's a point beyond which we don't go. We saw something that Moshe saw, but then he had a much deeper, richer experience, which we didn't have.
What is enough to establish him and his credibility? Like,
yes.
What is the single point? And then after that, he's established as the true prophet, and then...
Right, exactly. So that's what we need to understand. So I'm going to offer an interpretation of that, which will answer these two questions. Maybe there are other possible interpretations, but this is what I'm offering. Okay. So first of all, I want to say that the experiences of the Israelites and of Moshe overlapped. Right? They couldn't have been exactly the same for the reason that I just said. It's very important that the Rambam, on the basis of a Gemara that we've talked about in the past, at the end of the tractate Makos, says that the Bnei Yisrael, the Israelites, heard the first two of the 10 commandments themselves without any intermediary. But then they got scared and they said, this is too much. Let Moshe be the intermediary for those. Okay, so those they heard mipi hagvura, from the mouth of the Almighty. And we talked a few weeks ago about the Rambam's interpretation of that. Rambam says that it means that the Israelites grasped the demonstration of divine existence and divine unity intellectually. They understood the proof that God exists and the proof that God is one in a very strong sense, much stronger than the normal sense of unity. This was an intellectual apprehension. To say that Moshe had to be an intermediary for the remaining commandments is to say that they didn't grasp it intellectually. He did, and they didn't. And therefore he needed to convey it as an external commandment. Now,
the first two seem like the harder ones.
Yeah, but those are the abstract ones, right? Whereas the remaining of the 10 commandments, and you could say the same about most of the other, the 611 commandments beyond the first two, right? Those are mainly social laws. They're laws of social interaction. Honor your father and your mother. Don't steal. Don't murder, and so on.
So, on what basis were they able to grasp those?
Right. So they had to take those on the basis of some external authority. Right? It had to be a commandment to them because they would not be able to derive that those are the perfect laws of human society. And remember, for the Rambam, a human being is a political problem. Each one of us is a walking political problem. Each one of us is an intellect and a body with desires and needs. And those two elements of the human being often conflict, and they also fight for domination. So we need some law of self-control which will allow us to achieve our perfection. And our perfection, as we know from the earlier part of this part of the book, is the achievement of prophecy, which would be conjunction with the active intellect. And it would be becoming essentially intellect that is, if not yet separate from the body, then at least immune to its various temptations, and as far removed from it as one could be and still be alive.
And back to what you said earlier, then
Yeah.
what did we witness?
What we witnessed was to say that we witnessed anything is to say that we grasped these intellectual proofs.
And how did we get on that intellectual level?
How did we get there?
To do that?
How did we get there? Because there's
I don't know exactly, but through the slavery of Egypt and then the experiences at the Red Sea, we
How do
achieved
we
that.
get there now?
Now we have to learn how to carry out the proofs.
Right, okay.
But then that raises a question. Now, okay, so it's important to the authority of Moshe that the first part of the Ten Commandments are this purely intellectual variety. So the very fact that Moshe incorporates those two, divine existence and divine unity, shows that he's a prophet of intellect. Right? He's not just telling you some law that is human. He's telling you something that has at its pinnacle a purely intellectual apprehension.
Like don't steal and don't covet. Those are more human.
Those are human, and for us, since we can understand what the intellect is on the one hand, we can understand the body. We don't have a purely rational way of understanding how the two work together. If we did have such a way, we wouldn't need a law from the outside. Right? So,
And what about korbanot,
so
things
we,
like that?
yeah. So those, okay. So there's more to be said about those, which Rambam discusses in the guide, which has to do with human nature.
Okay. So then that's
But again, it's understanding what human nature is and what human beings have to do in order to get to a certain level. So I would say that we have to trust then that the same Moses who led us to these purely intellectual proofs also has a rational basis for the social and behavioral laws, even though we don't know what that basis is in the same way that he does. Right, so
Is that when you're talking about Talmud Mitzvot, or?
yes, the reasons for the commandments. So how does that work? Since we don't understand it in the same way that he does, it seems to me we have to take it as a kind of an assumption or a postulate that the laws are rational. And that becomes a basic principle of interpretation. And of course, it's the principle that Rambam himself is going to use in giving us the code of law, the Mishnah Torah, to which this book is the introduction. Right? So we have to assume that the law is rational and that Moshe understands the basis for it even though we don't. And then we interpret it in the most rational way possible. And that's the basis for Moshe's authority. Right? So it's based on reason. But it's an interesting basis because it's only partially based on reason in a way that we can actually understand. That's the first two commandments. And then the rest of it is based on reason as a postulate, as an assumption that we have to try to figure out. We have to apply ourselves in learning the Torah and understand how the laws are rational. But it's not as though they just sort of look that way, or they're like a mathematical proof or something. You can see that they are that way. You really have to work at it. And the Rambam has arranged the entire code in order to show how the laws are rational. So the entire Mishnah Torah is, if you like, the confirmation of the supremacy of Moshe. So it's not that the Torah is authoritative because we know that Moshe was the supreme prophet. But actually it turns out that Moshe is the supreme prophet because the law has to be treated as rational. And to a large extent, that's because of the needs of the human being. You could put it in a systematic way. We have a system here for understanding how to create the best possible human society. And that system requires that there be a supreme prophet, according to Rambam. And the Torah fits the criteria. The Torah presents us with Moshe, and Moshe, at least as Rambam understands him, is a philosopher who's also a legislator. Unlike all the other philosophers who have these visions and dreams, Rambam's images are laws. Right? He's the poet of the law, if you like. When he puts the imagery on the ideas, it comes out as the law for a human being.
It's just perfect for this week's parsha, right? So how can it be that anyone else could have carried out the test the way Yitro proposed that Moshe should do that?
Yeah.
If it's really the legislative power comes from him,
right.
It's almost impossible for Moshe to really create that construct that Yitro's presented for him.
I mean, sharing with other people. Yeah.
Even if you say that because in Yitro, it's, there's Yitro proposes a whole development for Moshe, right? Because it's a lot for him to undertake, and let's have certain levels to get to a certain, the most difficult adjudicated cases they'll take care of. But then there are certain levels, but that kind of applies to how other people are kind of adapting to that legislative system that he basically understands. It's basically who he is and the way his prophecy works.
Right.
So how can he actually delegate that power?
Yeah.
But he did.
And so how can he?
Yeah, but he has to. Right. So he has to overcome that challenge in order for this to be humanly possible, and also for it to be something that he can then give as an inheritance for people to continue in future generations.
But isn't there a difference between the basis of a law and the functioning of a law?
Yes.
So
there has to be that transition.
Right. So
you have to be a diet who can be interpreted.
So they're doing that's the functioning of the law, but the basis of the law is.
So you're saying that they were merely functional, that they didn't internalize and adjudicate the law.
They were on a functional level. They were applying the law, but the basis and the.
And anyone can be a diet.
No, you still have to. You still have to.
So then, what is that level? So that level is something that was closer.
Yeah,
to the uniqueness of motion.
That's you have to have logic. You have to know all the laws, and you can apply them. Just like
that's describing the importance of the way Moshe was thinking, and that's why he's the supreme prophet, because he kind of understands Torah that way.
He understood the reason behind it.
So I think you're both right. But so in order for for someone to adjudicate a legal conflict, they're not just applying the law in the sense of, you've got the textbook and then you see the situation and it fits, right? You have to have some of the understanding of human nature that Moshe has. You have to understand what human beings are. This weird combination of intellect and body and temptation and desire and so on. But if you didn't understand that, you wouldn't be able to apply it. So I think that the functioning of the law requires the internalization of this mosaic understanding of human nature. And that's something it's a big challenge for Moshe to transmit that to others, but it's necessary. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Okay, so that's what's special about Mosaic prophecy, I want to say. That number one, it incorporates this purely rational element that we understand as purely rational, namely the philosophical proofs of divine existence and unity. And number two, it involves a law that we assume to be rational. That's a sort of interpretive postulate. We have to interpret the law as being rational, even though we don't understand it rationally in the same way that he did.
Even Chok, what we call Chok is a rational law.
You have to make it as rational as you can, even if you can't fully succeed. And I think that's Rambam's approach in the Mishnah Torah. So he's exemplifying this. And of course, Mishnah Torah means the repetition of the Torah of Moshe. So that contrasts with the authority of all the prophets after Moses, which does depend on signs and wonders. So what do they have to do? So first of all, they've got to satisfy, of course, the necessary conditions. They have to be wise. and they have to be ethical people. Then they have to provide signs. And Rambam says it doesn't have to be a supernatural sign. It could be just a prediction that comes true or something like that. But they need some kind of sign. And that's interesting because remember, any sign is subject to doubt. Right? And this is going to be true of all the post-Mosaic prophets. You got to bear in mind that you could always be wrong. They might not really be prophets. But there's a procedure here. Just like there's a procedure for trusting a witness in court. You know, if the two witnesses corroborate each other and they pass all the tests, you are obliged to listen to them. Now, could be they're both lying somehow, right? But that's up to God to know. It's the same here with the post-Mosaic prophet. They pass the procedural tests. They're wise, they're ethical, they provide you with signs, and very importantly, they don't contradict anything that Moshe said. And yet for all that, God alone knows whether they're really prophets or not. Right? Now, I think what follows from the fact that Moshe is supreme, and his commandments, therefore, cannot be contradicted by anything that the prophet says. Well, there's a slight reservation which we'll get to, which is that the prophet can say there's a temporary emergency need to override something that Moshe said. But putting that aside, we see that the Torah that Moshe gave us is eternal, because nobody can ever contradict it. So no prophet is ever going to be able to come along, no matter how well confirmed their prophecy seems to be, and give you a new law that is different from the one that we already have.
So that's a response to Christianity, basically.
It's a response to Christianity and to Islam in slightly different ways. So it's a response to Christianity because of the idea that there is a new dispensation or a new commandment that supersedes the law of Moses, and that cannot be, as far as Rambam is concerned. It's a response to Islam for a slightly different reason, I think, which is that the Muslims claimed at that time that the Jews had altered the Torah. So this is the earliest version of biblical criticism. And the Muslims argued that at the time of Ezra, the return from Babylonian exile to the land of Israel, when we see that the Jews didn't really speak Hebrew anymore, and they have to be retaught and so on. Muslims basing themselves, I think, on some things that we can find in our tradition, but we wouldn't put it this way. They hold that Ezra rewrote the Torah in a way that was appropriate for the returned community, and therefore it's no longer the original law. Whereas on the Rambam's view, that couldn't have happened because we would never have done it, basically.
So it's not a polemical against, Muhammad's leadership. It's more about the way in which the Torah was preserved.
Yes.
Because they couldn't make that argument about Muhammad also? You couldn't be directing that to Muhammad also?
I don't know exactly what Rambam thinks about Muhammad, although he certainly refers to him in pejorative terms elsewhere, in the epistle to Yemen, for example, which is pretty standard in those texts. But it doesn't go into great detail, except insofar as what Muhammad said or is purported to have said impacts on the authenticity of Judaism. Okay, so
did you address the why it's in the plural, or is that coming up?
No, I think that's why it's in the plural that we saw.
Yeah.
Well, because each one of us, no matter what generation, I would say, I don't think it's a collective. I think it's each individual who is capable of understanding the proof of God's existence and unity. It's as if they're standing at Sinai now. That's the experience. To grasp the proof is to stand at Sinai.
So it's testimony in as much as the testimony was intellectual, not visual, say, for instance.
Yes.
So if we can have the same intellectual experience, then it's like...
Yeah. I mean, it does say in chapter 8, we saw the lightning and so on. And that's clearly meant to express what he's already described as a prophetic experience So it's not only intellectual, but it's an intellectual experience that overflows into the senses. It's an ecstatic experience.
Like it's both sorry.
But it's not visual sensory. It originates intellectually.
Yes, it originates intellectually. Yeah.
But it was both plural and singular at Sinai.
Mm-hmm.
So
right.
When you say the collective, you're talking about the Nasa v'Nishma part, or
right.
Bayan b'kol echad. I mean, it's also a singular.
Yeah, but
so
that's right. So it's about the formation of a people. But this particular first person plural, the experience at Sinai, at least the way he explains it, I would say grasping the proofs is an individual thing. And then Nasa v'Nishma, which he's not talking about here, is a sort of national affirmation or something like that. Okay, so now let's look at the 9th chapter on page 2 of the handout. And this whole chapter is drawing the consequences of what we just said about the supremacy of Moshe for the eternity of the Torah and the authority of all prophets who come after Moshe. And as I said last week, I think it's similar to the Ahmadi view in Islam and not the Sunni and Shia view. Sunni and Shia view of Muhammad is that when it says in the Quran that he is the seal of the prophets, that means he's the last one. No more prophets. The Ahmadi view is that the seal of the prophets is the authoritative one, to whom everybody else must be subordinate, but there can still be later prophets. And Rambam's view sounds to me very similar to Ahmadi. The Ahmadi view comes much later in the 19th century, but I'm just saying it's theologically similar. Okay, so first halacha of the 9th chapter, Davar barur u'meforosh b'Torah. It's clearly and explicitly set forth in the Torah, Shehi mitzvah omedes le'olam or le'omei olamim, that its ordinances will endure forever. Ein la lo shinui v'lo geron, lo tesefes. Without any variation, diminution, or addition. Shneimar, as it says, es kol hadavar shanochi mitzava eschem osot tishmerun la'asos. All this word which I command to you, that shall you observe to do. You shall not add to it nor take away from it. Lo sosif Allah v'lo sikra mimenu. V'ne'emar, and it says, v'aniglos lanu v'olenu ad olam, la'asos is called Divrei HaTorah azos. And the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. Hence the inference that to fulfill all the behests of the Torah is an obligation incumbent upon us forever. As it is said, Chukas olam b'dorosechem, it is an everlasting statute throughout your generations. V'ne'emar lo b'shamayim hi, and it says it is not in the heavens. So the way Rambam understands that famous verse is that it has been revealed, and no future revelation can ever change that. The power, in other words, is no longer in revelation from heaven to change the law or to add to it in any way. So you see, you learn from here that no prophet is permitted to make innovations in the Torah. Lefikach, therefore, im ya'amod ish bein min ha'omos bein Yisrael, if any person should arise, whether from the nations or from Israel, v'yase osa mofes, and he should perform any sign or wonder, v'yomar Hashem shlacho, and he says that God sent him, lahosif mitzvah, or ligroa mitzvah, either to add a commandment or to take away a commandment, or leforish b'mitzvah min ha'mitzvahs, or to explain any mitzvah, any commandment, perush lo shaman mimoshe, with some interpretation that we didn't hear from Moshe. In other words, contradicting the one that we did hear from Moshe. Or this person says that those commandments that were commanded to Israel through Moshe, einon la'olam, doros, are not forever and for all generations. Ela mitzvahs lefi zman hayu, they were just temporary. Harezen avi shakar, this is a false prophet. Shahari bo lahakish nevuasa shel Moshe, because we see that he came to contradict the prophecy of Moses. And he has the death penalty of strangulation, because he deliberately spoke in the name of God something that God did not command. Shehu baruch shemo, because God, blessed be his name, Tziva Moshe, commanded Moses, mitzvah hazos lanu levanenu ad olam, that this commandment is ours and our children's forever. Below ish el vichazev, and God is not a human being that he should lie. So I think, as already said, that's a response both to Christianity and to Islam. And I think it's also really interesting to notice that Rambam says, if anyone should arise, whether among the Gentiles or among the Israelites. But why did he need to say that? Could have just said, if anybody arises.
Because there were prophets within Tanakh who were not Jewish.
Yes. So he's coming to emphasize that being an authentic prophet has nothing to do with your lineage or your ethnic
gender.
basis, or there's no mention of gender either.
But he says that elsewhere.
Yes, he does. And he emphasizes this explicitly in the epistle to Yemen, which had such an impact on the Yemenite Jews that to this day, in the Yemenite liturgy, they mention Rambam in the Kaddish, because they feel that he saved their whole community. He wrote this at a time when they were under tremendous pressure from various people claimed to be prophets and were telling them to convert to Islam. So in the epistle to Yemen, he says, this is on the handout on page 3, Roman numeral 2, number 3. He says, our disbelief in the prophecy of Omar and Zaid, any two sort of random people, is not due to the fact that they are non-Jews, or maybe those were particular prophets, I don't remember, as the unlettered folk imagine. So uneducated people might think, we don't believe them because they're non-Jews. No, that's not the reason. They could be prophets regardless of that. And in consequence of which they are compelled to justify their standpoint from the biblical statement, from thy midst out of thy brethren. Right? So it does say, I'm going to raise up for you a prophet after Moshe who is one of you. We'll come back to that in a minute. But Rambam says that does not show that all prophets are Jewish. It says, for Job, so far, Bildad, Eliphaz, and Elihu are all considered prophets and are non-Jews. On the other hand, although Hananiah ben Azor was a Jew, he was deemed an accursed and false prophet. So conversely, you could be Jewish and be a false prophet. This has nothing to do with Jewish, non-Jewish.
Also doesn't mention Bilam.
Right. Yes.
Why not?
I don't know why not.
Because he was not a positive or a negative prophet.
Yeah, I don't know. But obviously he's another good example. Whether one should yield credence to a prophet or not depends upon the nature of his doctrines and not upon his lineage, as we shall explain presently. Okay, so I think it's the same idea in the in our halacha as it was in the epistle to the Ammonite Jews. So that raises a further question, because remember he said in what we just read that the uneducated people in Yemen said, we don't listen to the non-Jewish prophets because they're not Jewish. And the basis for that was this pasuk, the verse, I shall raise up for you a prophet from thy midst out of thy brethren. So that's exactly what he goes on to address in the next halacha in the chapter. That's halacha 2. Im kain lama ne'emar b'Torah navi akim lehem mikarav achehem kamocha. Why does it say, I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren like you? Lo la'asos das huba, not to come and found a religion. That's not the purpose of this verse or of the future establishment of a new prophet. Ela letzavos al devrei HaTorah, but to make commands regarding the words of the Torah, in other words, the law that Moshe has already given, ulahazhir ha'am shelo yavru aleha, and to charge the people and exhort them not to transgress it. So in other words, that verse is about the successors to Moshe. He's saying to the people, you're going to have, he's saying to Moshe, they're going to be people like you, who will be prophets, who will lead the people of Israel, and they will reinforce the message that you already gave. They won't add to it. They won't be the same sort of legislative prophet that you were. Just as the last of the prophets, Malachi, so this is at the very end of the Tanakh, says, Zichru Toras Moshe Avdi, remember the law of Moses, my servant. So the last prophecy recorded in Tanakh refers back to Moshe, because once Moshe has come, all prophecy refers back to him and to his legislation. Similarly, if the prophet gives an order in regard to things that are permissible, obviously there are things that the Torah leaves open. They're neither obligatory nor forbidden. They are just permitted. Suppose a new prophet comes and tells you, do this thing that Moshe didn't talk about, or don't do this thing that Moshe didn't talk about. Well, that may be also legitimate, right? So if he says, I could go, L'chula makam ploni, go to this and this place. Al telchu, don't go there. Right? So that's a very specific commandment that the prophet, say it's Yehoshua, is giving the people. And that's fine as well. That's not contradicting the Torah of Moses. Asu milchama hayom, make war today. O al tasu, or don't make war today. Benu chomazu, o al tivnu, build this wall or don't build it. It's a very politically apt mitzvah lishmo alo. So then there is a commandment to listen to the prophet, again on the assumption that he meets all the other conditions, wise, ethical, and so on, and as we've said, doesn't contravene any mitzvah that Moshe gave.
That's why the one who's telling us to build the wall is not going to
Okay. V'ha'over al dvarav, and someone who transgresses the words of such a prophet, chayav misa b'dei shamayim, deserves death, but not through a human tribunal at the hands of heaven. Shnema v'haya ish asher lo yishma el dvarai, and the person who does not hearken unto the words, to my words, asher yidaber b'shmi, which are spoken in my name, anochi edrosh me'imo, I, in other words, God, will seek it from him. Okay, so that's an important mitzvah, and as we'll see, that's procedural. In other words, you don't know for sure whether such a prophet is genuinely in communication with God or not, just like you don't know ultimately whether a witness is telling the truth or not, but if they've passed all the procedural tests, you should believe them unless and until there's some proof otherwise. Okay. Right. And the general purpose of post-Mosaic prophecy then is to further the achievement of Moshe in some way. Moshe has given us this law that is the basis for a society within which human individuals can pursue the perfection that is possible for a human being. And everybody else should be contributing to that project and not going against it. Okay. Should I pause there? Any questions? Comments? Okay. So then the third halacha, Rambam says, "V'kein navi she'aval al divrei atzmo." The same thing applies to a prophet who goes against his own word. Right? He's not exempt from that. B'hakovesh nevuaso, or he somehow denies his own prophecy. He also would deserve death again at the hands of heaven, not a human tribunal. Of all of those, it says, I, God, will seek it from him. If somebody who we know to be a prophet says, to transgress one of the commandments that is given in the Torah, al mitzvahs harbe ben kalas ben chamuros, or maybe many mitzvahs, whether they are light or stringent, lefi shah, if it's an emergency and it's temporary, mitzvah lishmo alo, then it's a mitzvah to listen to this prophet. So that's a new element. I said that was going to come, right? That there could be an emergency measure where the prophet sees that for the sake of preserving the Mosaic society, you have to break the law. As long as it's And And so we learnt from the ancient sages on the authority of tradition.
Who's he talking about?
Probably, yeah. That's a good example.
Yes. Well, that's what he's going to say. Right. He's going to talk about Eliyahu. But he must also mean the way in which the sages interpret what was going on with Eliyahu, presumably. And this is, sorry, I skipped a line. Im yo malacha hanavi avor al divrei Torah. If the prophet says to you, transgress the words of Torah, ke Eliyahu bahar ha-Carmel, like Elijah on Mount Carmel, shmalo, listen to him, chutz me avodas chachamim, except for idolatry. Now, there's a problem which you mentioned last week, which is if you look at the story, he does say to the priests of Baal, you should make this offering, this idolatrous offering. So I don't quite know how to reconcile that with what actually happens in the story. That's an interesting question. I'm open to suggestions, but clearly Rambam knows that story better than we do. I don't know how he understood it.
I mean, it's a dangerous game, right?
Yes.
Because, first of all, how do you know really? They could say it's a shastachat, but it's not a shastachat. I mean, like a medial. Right? So that's the first thing, and that could have it could be long-standing.
Yes.
So how do you know that you can believe them in that state A? B, could he, if it's going to be everything except for Avodas Chachamim, based on the way the Rambam understands Avodas Chachamim, it could be many things in that category. So it's almost like you can never listen to them.
Right.
Because it could end up...
There are dangers that are addressed by recent philosophers, not by Rambam, about the very idea of a state of emergency. Mm-hmm. Because many authoritarian states function in just that way. Ideally we should have freedom of speech, but there's the enemy is that they're at the door and they're threatening us, and therefore we have to just temporarily suspend civil liberties. But it turns out there's always an enemy, and it's always a state of emergency.
So it becomes permanent.
Yes, so that's a danger that he does not address here, which is very much discussed in contemporary political philosophy.
It also depends on what the person thinks the danger is.
Yes,
It doesn't mean the same thing to everybody.
No. That's a good point. Right, so, Kagon Eliyahu Bahara Carmel, just like Elijah on Mount Carmel, Shehikri of Ola Bachutz, he was bringing a sacrifice outside the temple of Yerushalayim Nivcheres Lekach, even though Jerusalem had already been chosen for that purpose, and somebody who brings a sacrifice outside the sanctuary at that stage would be subject to excision, cutting off from the Jewish people. Navi, but because he was a prophet, mitzvah lishmo'alo, nevertheless it was a commandment to listen to him. And to this case also applies the general commandment with this post-Mosaic prophet, you should listen to him. And suppose they had asked Elijah, and they said to him, how can we possibly go against and uproot what is already written in the Torah, that you shouldn't bring your sacrifices in any place, it has to be in the temple? He would have said, it's only somebody who does this as a permanent institution that would be subject to the penalty of excision. Moshe, just as Moses commanded. I'm doing it just today, outside the sanctuary, at the command of God, in order to refute the prophets of Baal. Similarly, with all the prophets, if they were to make such commandments temporarily, then mitzvah lishmo alahem. It's a mitzvah to listen to them. But if they said this should be permanently changed, then such a person would be subject to the death penalty. And in this case, it would be a humanly a human tribunal executing the death penalty and not divine. Because the Torah says this commandment was given to us and our children forever.
Wow. That's dangerous business.
Yes. So, right, as you're absolutely right, and as we've been saying, this is something that one, as a political structure, one would have to worry about its misuse. Okay, so let's look at the fourth halacha. Similarly, suppose it's not a commandment that's actually written down, but it's in the oral Torah. But nevertheless, it's traced back to Moshe. And if then a prophet comes along and uproots such a thing, or in something that is inferred from the Torah in the traditional manner, God commanded that this is the rule, and we say that the decision goes in accordance with so-and-so and not in accordance with some other opinion, and all of that is traditional Torah Shabal Peh, oral Torah. Such a person who claims to go against even an oral Torah matter on the basis of revelation and prophecy deserves the death penalty as well. Right? Again, presumably if it's a permanent contravention of those laws. Even though he may have performed some sign, right? Right? Because first of all, he's coming to refute the Torah itself. The Torah says it is not in the heavens. In other words, it's not in the power of revelation and prophecy to go against what was already given. But if it's a temporary state of emergency, then in this too, we would have to listen to a prophet. So a prophet who made a change in a rabbinically inferred law or a traditional law, but it was only temporary, then there would be a commandment to listen to him as well.
Halachically, that gets very complicated.
Yes.
Because once you have something like this, where it's going to be done halachically, then it sets a precedent. Even though it's a one-time or two-time precedent, then there's a precedent that people refer back to.
Yes.
Because that's Torah Shabbat. Like that's something that
it
the community.
Yeah.
Unless I think Rambam wants it stated very clearly that this is a Shabbat. It's not normal.
Why some of my parents do it all the time.
Right.
No, that was only the fisha, you know.
Yes.
No, but that's
destroys the mimetic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But once it's rabbinic and it's not set in the Torah, and then you do something.
Yes.
Certainly,
again, a danger of that. Yeah. So we just
innovation of halacha is something that you could be involved in here.
Right.
And it doesn't necessarily have to. There are times within halacha where you have to innovate and you have to shift given the circumstances. It's not necessarily shatcha.
Yes.
We're not talking about in the Shoah and someone's eating on Yom Kippur. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about actual shifts of practice.
Yes.
And that will be followed for future generations from that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it could be. I mean, we see the case that he's mentioned is Eliyahu on Mount Carmel.
But that's against a dioraisa.
Yes.
It's different.
Right.
Rabbanan is more fluid in the sense.
Now, of course, this is not the only view. There are people who, notwithstanding the verse that says it's not in the heavens, people who have appealed to revelation to make halachic decisions. There's a famous book called Shiur Min HaShamayim, Responses from Heaven, and which just gives such responses and also describes the procedure, how someone who's a holy enough sage should go through various procedures and then go to sleep and they wake up with the answer. But Rambam's rationalist approach would be opposed to this. So we have time to do the last halacha of the 9th chapter. We're talking about the the general run of commandments, aval ba'avodas kochavim, but with idolatry, ein shomin lo, afilu lefisha. There you don't listen to him even in a state of emergency. And of course this is part of Rambam's view, that the purpose of the law is to achieve proper knowledge of God's existence and unity. To worship idols would be to go against that. So this would be not just to save the law by some extraordinary measure, but to go against the whole purpose of the law. So that you should not do. Afilu asa osos and mofsim gedolos, even if such a person did amazing signs and wonders, v'omar she'Hashem tziva, she'tzei aved avos chachamim, and said, God commanded that you should do idolatry, hayom bilvad, only today, o b'shah zu, and at this time, bilvad, only now, harizeh diber sora al Hashem. Such a person speaks perversely against God. V'alzeh tziva hakasav v'omar, and on this the verse says, uva ha'osamo face, and even if a sign or wonder comes to pass, lo tishma al divrei hanavi hahu, don't listen to that prophet. That's a false prophet. Ki diber sora al Hashem Elokeichem, because he's spoken perversely against the Lord your God. Shehari bola hakish nevosa shel Moshe, because he came to undermine the prophecy of Moses. Ulefikach neida b'vadai, and therefore we know for sure shehu navi sheker, that he's a false prophet. V'kol ma she'asa balat v'kishiv asa v'yachanek. So whatever signs and wonders he did must have been fraudulent and performed through some kind of trickery or sleight of hand, and he deserves the death penalty. So I think that what's interesting about the view here is that we have, on the one hand, I would say, this eternal, unchangeable law, and again, that fits the system. If human nature has a certain character, it's an intellect with a body and so on, then as long as human nature doesn't change, then the perfect law for governing human nature is not going to change either. However, implicit in all this, there is a certain adaptability of the law. To examine how far that goes, we have to look at the code itself, insofar as we've seen that the basis for the authority of Moshe himself is the rationality of the law. And we have to assume that the law is rational when we interpret it. And that will certainly involve taking into consideration sometimes facts that may be known scientifically. So there are cases, although we're not going to get that far in the code, where there may be scientific facts that were not known to the early sages, which are now known to us, which would lead to a slightly different way of thinking and a slightly different way of understanding the halacha. So there is room within constraints for a certain adaptability to our knowledge, and that goes with the rationality of the Torah. But in general, the picture is that just as human nature is unchanging, so too is the law that was given to us through Moshe for the governance of that human nature also eternal and unchanging.
So one question?
Yeah.
So back to Eliyahu HaNavi from?
Yes.
So Eliyahu HaNavi was very clearly doing idolatry and telling people to do idolatry. Could it be that he's talking about idolatry for the whole people? And in that case, Eliyahu was off the hook.
Right.
Because he singled out a certain community that was engaged in idol worship anyway and continuing to do it. And then he tells them, specifically, it's not for the people.
Yes.
But to kind of like prove. So could that be a possibility? I don't know any other
way
out of that.
I really like the suggestion. So before I came over, I was looking back in Malachim Aleph, in the Book of Kings, to see if there was some way to understand it. And I came up with that as well, because he says to the Nevi'ei Baal, he says to the prophets of Baal, you go and do your thing and bring your sacrifice, and then we'll see what happens. He doesn't say it to anybody else. Maybe something different.
So in Hay,
yes,
could it be that they're talking about like a collective bidding? Like presumably the Navi is talking to the Am,
yes.
right? So
Right.
it's not like you get your little prophecy and you get your little
Yes,
prophecy. Everyone
yes.
needs to be included.
Right.
So there wasn't a directive.
Yes.
So in that way, it's very clear that this is not something that's going to be for
Yeah.
all time. It's going to be specific. So
I think that's a great
that's the
suggestion.
only way.
I think it's a really good
It
suggestion.
doesn't make
But
sense.
was he speaking in God's name? Then?
Yes.
That's a good question too.
Oh,
'cause he
yeah.
was. But that's
Another
again,
issue. You
that's
could say
another
that
issue.
wasn't his nevuah. He was just, I don't know. Maybe he was just telling them that himself in his own name. Right? It doesn't say God says, go and bring the sacrifice. That's another possibility. Can the Navi speak sometimes ex officio, sometimes in his office? Now I'm speaking as the prophet. Now I'm just speaking as a private individual. Right? That's another possibility that you suggested.
But when he's on Har Carmel, he's like stating it like
Right.
it's
Yeah.
in the
But he
name
could
of
switch.
God.
He could switch positions. Okay, great. So I think we've got two suggestions that are worth thinking about. Thank you.